In this video, you're going to find out how I took my mix from this
Looking for a sign of life. Looking for something to help me burn out bright.
to this.
Looking for something to help me burn out bright.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Today we are taking another look at how I mixed one of the covers that I've put out on my channel. Today we are taking a look at the Learn to Fly video. This was a really good session. I had a lot of fun in this environment. We were in a very, very old chapel that had some amazing acoustics, and we were able to use that in the track, and we're going to take a look at how we got those sounds in the cover. Remember, you can always check out that cover in one of the links down below. So let's go ahead and get started. So I went ahead and did most of the editing. This is actually after the cover has been released, so we're not going to have a time lapse of everything being done, but we're just going to go right in, and we'll start with the drums like we did with the last one. You can see I sectioned out the toms just like last time. I have the rack and the floor tom all chopped up. The only other channel that I did that with was the tambourine here, and that was just to make sure that there was no bleed because it was a condenser mic. I didn't want to have the bleed of the condenser coming in on the choruses where it wasn't needed. But we'll start with the kick. So up top on the kick, let me bring the mix window over. So starting with the kick, you'll notice that I do still have the MXL and the B52 in here, as well as a kick bus that I used. We'll go ahead solo these up. We'll take a listen without all of these additional attachments, and then with, I'm also going to take off everything on the bus itself, and we'll see what it sounds like without all of it, and then I'll open it up, show you the settings, and we'll see what it sounds like with it. All right, fairly simple. It's a kick. So there was a little bit of a challenge with recording this. She didn't have a porthole cut in her kick, so I had to position the MXL and the B52 on the outside of the head. I could have done a little more experimenting and getting the sound just right, but I was hasty and I didn't take the time to listen back and try and get the right position. We were also in a little bit of a hurry that day, but I think I was able to get a fairly good kick sound for what I had. So we'll start with the MXL channel. So I had the basic high pass going on here just to get rid of a decent amount of low end. That was then going into the R channel right here. Because I didn't have enough frequency bands on the R channel, that's why I have the Q3 in here, or sorry, the Q1 in here, just to get a little bit of the low end out of the way, but I wanted to get that boost at around 40 hertz. So we've got the boost at 36, 40-ish, a dip around 100, and a continuation of that dip here with a little bit of a boost around 4,000 hertz. That was kind of the range that I was getting the attack in, so that's how I used most of the MXL. As you can see in the mix, the MXL was fairly low in comparison to everything, so I wanted to kind of just use it for flavoring, not necessarily as a backbone of the kick. We also have the CLA2A, a trusted compressor that I like to use on a lot of my drum channels. And then moving on, let me close all these out. Moving on, we have the B52 channel. So this one, I did a fairly similar method. I had two different sets of R channels for two different EQs, just because the R channel doesn't have that many EQ bands in it. But so remember, never mix by sight. I just got a sound that I was happy with and stuck with it. I used a little bit of the compressor on this first one over here. The threshold's at about -4.3, but you can see that EQ. It's a little wonky, but I promise it sounds fairly good. And then it all goes into the 2A yet again. And then lastly, moving on to the kick bus, where both of my drum channels are headed. We have the Q8. I decided to go with a basic EQ here. This was just EQing the overall channel and kind of gluing it all together. And then I had the Kramer PIE. I've never had much experience with this compressor, but I decided to pull it out because I'd seen other engineers use it and I was really liking the sound. So I decided to try it out myself. And when I pulled it out, was very surprised and very happy with the sounds I got. So we have the Kramer, and we also have the C1 comp. Now the C1 comp is actually working as a little bit of a sidechain compressor. You can see here on the snare channel, I have a bus set up, bus 12. That is the key input for my C1 compressor for the kick. I was getting a little bit of snare bleed, so I wanted to take it out some just to help out a little bit. And trust me, it did. We'll listen to it with and without that comp in. So there are the settings for the kick bus. So we're going to listen without the sidechain and then with. You can hear the snare kind of coming through a little bit crazy. So let's see what it sounds like with the comp on. So it's nothing crazy, but it is a fairly good help. It doesn't sound like a lot when you're listening to just the kick by itself, but once you hear it in reference with the rest of the mix, it sounds very different. It doesn't affect the sound that I have on my snare at all. Moving on from there, we have the snare itself. So I had a gate here, but I decided not to keep it in. I think I just left it on the channel before I finished the mix and I forgot to turn it off. Just take that out now so we don't get any confusion. And then, trusty as always, I pulled out the Empirical Labs and Soft Tube Team Up. I used the Lil Freak EQ and the Mikey Comp. What can I say? I really like these. Just like before, I pulled out presets for it. I started with the snare fix and the snare drum for the compressor here. Really simple approach to it. Nothing super crazy with the EQ except a little bit in the low mids. I was just getting a little bit of low end that I didn't like in the snare, and that taking it out helped a lot. So we'll listen to it without these in and then with. Her snare has a lot of body and I really liked that, but I needed a little bit of punch, something to cut through the mix, and that helped out a lot between the compressor and the EQ for it. Moving on to the toms. The toms were very tricky. So she has an interesting way of tuning, but she also likes to dampen them a lot, which I like because I don't want too much resonance. And with the condensers, the Audio Technicas, the little AE3000s that I had on them, they sounded fantastic and phenomenal, but they picked up a lot and were super, super detailed. Let's go over here right before the tom hit. So this is what it sounds like without anything. I used the Q6 and the CLA2A for the rack tom. You can see the EQ I have here again. Right around here for number 6, it was around 5K almost actually, that I picked up a lot of the attack, so I wanted to pull the attack up. And then on the second band here around 15, I got a little bit of resonance that I didn't want, so I pulled it out there. So let's see what it sounds like without anything in and then with. Like I said, these mics were very, very sensitive and picked up everything very accurately. I like the sound of the rack tom especially, but then once we put these two plugins on, you'll hear a little bit of a difference. It starts to sound a little bit more like a rock tom, not so much just a tom, but that's the whole point of me doing any of this. Again, on this one I have the Lil Freak, but I ended up not using it and just forgot to turn it off. So for the floor tom, I was having a lot of trouble with getting any sort of resonance out of it. Again, the way she had them, she dampened them a lot. And while that sounded good, it did provide a couple issues. So we'll listen to it without here, and then we'll go over them in. So you see there, it's just a solid thud. To help with that, I pulled up the low end of the tom on the first band here. It was boosted around 63, took a cut out of the middle where there's nothing that a tom's going to produce, and gave it a little bit more of an attack on the third band here around 6K. And then it goes from there into the CLA 3A. There is not a ton of peak reduction here, but there is a lot of gain boosting up. It was a very low signal. I don't think I had my gain structure quite how I should have, but live and learn. This is as much a learning process for me as it is for anyone watching these videos. From there, it goes into the R bass. So the R bass, I like to use it mostly on bass, but the R bass pulls out resonance like crazy. You can set it up to be a different frequency, but I found that the 80 hertz that it's set on automatically worked very well. So we'll listen with just the R channel in the 3A, and then we'll show it with the R bass in. That adds a lot with just those two, with the EQ and the compression. But then with the R bass, you hear that little bit of resonance just after the tom hit. And it's subtle, but it adds so much in the final mix. From there, we move on to the overheads. The overheads, I used a trick with the compressor that I had learned when I was an intern. Get rid of these two EQs because I ended up not really using any EQ. But I set the fastest attack release, put it at a ratio of 20. This works really well with any 1176 plugin, or if you have an actual 1176 compressor. And then you just adjust the input and output to match. And this goes for both of them. I think I may have changed... No, I didn't change anything on these. I've got the exact same thing running on both of those channels. So on the mic E comp, I went with the overhead smash. That really pushed the overheads up a lot. So the 1176 plugin helped a lot to eliminate sounds that I didn't want. It really pulls back tom hits, snare hits. If the kick's coming through even, it helps pull those back with this compressor, but then it lets the cymbals resonate out afterwards. From there, I used the mic E to actually bring up the level and the overall little bit of saturation on the overheads. So let me solo those up, turn the plugins off, and then we'll turn them back on and see how they sound. And then with the 76, you'll hear the drums come down a little bit and the cymbals coming up. You hear the drums basically stay at the same level, but the cymbals are brought up overall. And then once I bring in the mic E, so crisp. I love the sound of those things. And then I had the full kit mic. I tried to find a way to use it in there, but again, I wasn't quite happy with the placement. I put the Kramer on it. It still didn't help much, so I'll turn it on so you guys can see what it sounds like. But it ended up being a lot of snare and cymbals that just weren't necessary and didn't add anything to the mix. And I'll show you what it sounds like here without the Kramer as well. I think if I try a different placement, maybe a little bit closer to the kick, like dead center pointed down, I might have a better chance of picking up something that'll be useful in the future, but we'll see. I'm going to turn that back down. And actually, I'm just going to make it inactive and get it out of the way. Now, moving on to the rooms, we used the Kramer. Again, this ended up being my room mic compressor go-to for almost every single channel, if not every channel. And then I used a little bit of an EQ to get rid of some of the low end. I don't want the kick coming through the room too much, just because it feels awkward in comparison to like a snare having reverb or the cymbals or even the toms having reverb. So we'll solo those up, listen without these, and then with. Turn them back on. Sounds pretty cool. It's hard to appreciate them until they're in with the rest of the kit. And then the tambourine, let me jump to the verse here and we'll listen to it. You can see that compressor's kicking in a lot because I'm trying to get rid of as much snare and kit as I can because I want this to only focus on the tambourine. I don't want to get everything else in there. It worked, I think, especially in the sense of the verse mix, but that's my opinion. So what we'll do is we'll solo up the drums and then we'll go over the plugins that I have on the bus itself. And we'll listen with and without the room mics as well, just to show you the difference. All right. Now, honestly, I could have lived with just that as my drum sound, but I wanted to take it a step further, just a step. Put a little bit of an EQ here at the very beginning, just to pull out the 4K, because that had a little bit of an annoying overhead hiss to it. But it wasn't just the overhead, it was kind of coming through all the mics, so I just pulled it out on the bus just to make all of the drums even out. From there, it runs into the CLA 2.8 to give it a nice little crunch down and then push. And then lastly, it goes into a limiter to kind of like smash it all down to the same level if it ever starts peaking. So you heard it there without everything in, and then we'll turn them all on and you can see what they sound like alone. So that's it for the drums. Thank you so much for watching. The drums normally take a little bit more than everything else. That's why I section it off in its own mixing video. I've got the other ones coming out very soon and you'll be able to see them. So stick around if you want to see how I mix the rest of Learn to Fly.
Looking for something to